She answered the call by mistake, the Mafia boss's chilling words. "From now on, you're mine." In his world, every call is a command. Every word is a weapon. He is the king of an empire built on shadows and fear, a man who takes whatever he wants. She was a ghost, a random number, a complete nobody, or so she thought. But when her phone rang by mistake, she didn't just stumble into his world. She became its next acquisition. He never asks. He only claims. And his claim was absolute. "From now on, you're mine."
Hey, story lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go.
The silence in the city archives was a living thing, thick with the scent of aging paper and leather binding. For Emma Moore, it was a sanctuary. Here, amidst the ghosts of history, the chaos of the present world couldn't touch her. Her slender fingers, smudged with archival dust, delicately traced the faded ink on a 19th-century city charter. Her life was a study in quiet precision, a small apartment, a demanding but passion-fueled job as a junior archivist, and a carefully maintained distance from the complications of other people. She was invisible, and she liked it that way. It was safe. The ancient building that housed the archives groaned around her, its bones settling into the cool evening air. Emma had always found comfort in these sounds, the whispered conversations between old wood and stone, the gentle symphony of a structure that had weathered decades of storms. Her colleagues had long since departed, leaving her alone with the musty embrace of forgotten records and dusty tomes. This was her domain, her fortress of solitude where the present couldn't intrude upon the past. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and squinted at the faded script before her. The document she was cataloging was particularly fascinating, a land deed from 1887 that revealed a forgotten scandal involving the city's founding families. These were the moments that made her pulse quicken, not the artificial thrills that others sought in nightclubs or adventure sports, but the authentic electricity of uncovering buried truths. History had layers, like an archaeological dig, and she was an expert excavator of secrets. The sudden, shrill buzz of her phone on the metal table was a violation. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She frowned, her concentration shattered. It was probably another telemarketer, another automated voice promising to lower her non-existent mortgage rates. She reached over to silence it, to banish the intrusion, but her hand paused. For a reason she would never be able to explain, a flicker of impulse, a whisper of curiosity, made her swipe to answer. Her finger hovered over the decline button for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Something about the number itself seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't place why. It wasn't saved in her contacts, wasn't one of the handful of people who actually had reason to call her. Her mother, her supervisor, the local pizza place, that was essentially the extent of her social circle. Yet this number tugged at some buried memory, like a half-remembered dream. "Hello," she said, her voice small in the vast, silent room. The acoustics of the archive were strange at night. Her voice seemed to echo back to her from the towering shelves, multiplied and distorted until it sounded like a chorus of whispers. She pressed the phone closer to her ear, straining to hear over the sudden awareness of her own breathing. There was no greeting, only the faint sound of what might have been ice clinking in a glass, followed by a voice that was not a sound but a temperature. It was deep, cold, and coated in a calmness more terrifying than any shout. "The transfer is complete," the voice stated. It wasn't a question, it was a fact. The words hung in the air like smoke. Emma felt a chill race down her spine, entirely unrelated to the archive's perpetual coolness. There was something in that voice, an authority that brooked no argument, a certainty that suggested the speaker had never been questioned in his life. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Emma pulled the phone from her ear, looked at the screen again. Unknown. "I'm sorry," she said, bringing it back. "I think you have the wrong number." The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. She could hear him breathing on the other end, slow and measured, like a predator deciding whether its prey was worth the chase. When he finally responded, it was with a sound that made her blood freeze. A low chuckle echoed down the line, a dry, humorless sound. No, I don't. The certainty in those 3 words was absolute. This wasn't confusion or a case of mistaken identity. This was something else entirely, something that made the archive's familiar shadows seem suddenly menacing. Emma's grip tightened on the phone as a cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, pricked at the base of her neck. This wasn't a wrong number. This felt intentional. "Who is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The pause that followed stretched for an eternity. She could feel him on the other end, a predator savoring the moment. There was the faint sound of movement, perhaps him leaning back in a chair, the soft rustle of expensive fabric. When he finally spoke again, his voice was a velvet threat, a quiet declaration of absolute ownership that would be seared into her memory forever. "From now on," he said slowly, each word a hammer blow against the walls of her safe, quiet world, "you're mine." The line went dead. Emma stared at the phone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The screen had gone dark, reflecting her pale, shocked face back at her. Her hands trembled as she tried to process what had just happened. It had to be a prank. A sick, twisted joke. Some college student with too much time and a twisted sense of humor. But even as she tried to rationalize it, she knew better. There had been something in that voice, a weight, an authority, a bone-deep certainty that spoke of real power. This wasn't some teenager making prank calls. This was something far more dangerous. Her hands trembled as she navigated the screen and blocked the number, a flimsy digital shield against a voice that already felt like it was inside her head. The action felt pathetically inadequate, like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. But it was something, a small act of defiance against the helplessness that threatened to overwhelm her. She tried to return to the city charter, to the comforting dust of the past, but the ink swam before her eyes. The familiar words looked foreign now, as if written in a language she no longer understood. The silence of the archive no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how alone she was, how vulnerable. The old building creaked around her, but now every sound seemed ominous. Was that just the building settling, or were those footsteps on the floor above? The heating system's hum had become a sinister whisper, and the shadows between the shelves seemed to pulse with hidden watchers. She thought blocking the number would be the end of it. She couldn't have been more wrong. The man on the other end didn't need a phone to reach her. Emma packed up her things with unsteady hands, shoving documents and notes into her bag with none of her usual care. The familiar ritual of closing up the archive felt foreign now. Each step weighted with an anxiety she couldn't shake. As she locked the heavy wooden door behind her, she found herself looking over her shoulder, scanning the empty corridor for threats that logic told her weren't there. The walk to her car felt endless. Every shadow could be hiding a figure, every sound could be approaching footsteps. Her keys jingled too loudly in the night air as she fumbled with the lock, and when the engine finally turned over, she felt a momentary wave of relief. But even as she drove through the familiar streets toward home, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. Across the city, in a penthouse that pierced the clouds, Anthony Wilson swirled amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler. The sprawling metropolis below was a glittering circuit board of lights, every single one a part of his domain. He was a man carved from marble and shadows, his face a study in sharp angles and unnerving stillness. His suit was impeccable, his control absolute. The office that surrounded him was a testament to wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while expensive art lined the walls, pieces that museums would kill to display, acquired through means that were never questioned. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a few carefully chosen items. A vintage fountain pen that had once belonged to a railroad baron, a crystal paperweight containing a real bullet, and a tablet displaying information that most people would die to possess. Anthony Wilson was 42 years old, though he looked younger. Good genetics, better living, and a complete absence of conscience had preserved him well. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his olive skin unmarked by the stresses that aged other men. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, pale gray and utterly cold, like chips of winter sky. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and been moved by nothing. A subordinate, a nervous man named Kenneth Jackson, stood rigidly a few feet away. Kenneth had been with the organization for 8 years, long enough to know better than to speak unless spoken to. He was thin and pale, with the look of a man who spent his days handling other people's dirty work and his nights trying to forget what he'd seen. "Sir, the Garcetti accounts are liquidated. The assets have been absorbed," Kenneth reported, his voice carefully neutral. The Garcetti family had made the mistake of skimming from Wilson's operations. They were no longer a concern. Anthony didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on a tablet resting on the polished mahogany desk beside him. On the screen was a live security feed from a quiet street, the entrance to an old brick apartment building. The feed was crystal clear, courtesy of a camera that had been installed just that morning by a city maintenance crew that didn't exist. On another part of the screen, a file was open. It was a dossier on Emma Moore, and it was disturbingly comprehensive. Her photo, a candid shot of her laughing with a colleague outside the museum, had been taken 6 months ago. The file contained her work schedule, meticulously tracked for 3 months. Her financial statements, revealing a life of careful penny pinching and student loan payments. Her grocery habits, documented through loyalty card data that had been acquired through channels she would never suspect. Her exercise routine, a brief morning jog 3 times a week. Her dating history, which was remarkably sparse. Her family connections, including a brother who had proven to be a useful point of leverage. Her entire life, distilled into cold, hard data. "Good," Anthony said, his voice the same chilling calm from the phone call. He lifted the tumbler to his lips and took a measured sip. The whiskey was older than some of his employees, a bottle that had cost more than most people's cars. He made a dismissive gesture with his free hand. "You may go." Kenneth Jackson scurried from the room, visibly relieved to be escaping the oppressive atmosphere. The man's fear was almost palpable, a familiar perfume that Anthony had long since learned to savor. Fear was the foundation of respect, and respect was the foundation of power. Alone now, Anthony allowed himself a small smile as he studied the screen. He watched the tiny figure of Emma Moore's car pull up to her building, watched her hurry up the steps clutching her coat tightly around her. Even through the security feed, he could see her nervousness, the way she kept looking over her shoulder as if she could feel his eyes on her even from miles away. And she was right to be afraid. Anthony Wilson was not a man who acted on impulse. Every move he made was calculated, every decision weighed against potential outcomes. This wasn't a whim. It was a move on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. The game had been in motion for months, each piece carefully positioned for maximum effect. He tapped a single command into his tablet, and somewhere across the city, wheels were set in motion. Phone calls were made, orders were given, and the invisible machinery of his organization lurched into action. Execute phase 2. The chess game was about to become much more interesting. The next morning, it began with the delivery. Emma had barely finished her first cup of coffee when the knock came at her door. She wasn't expecting anything. Her online orders were few and far between, limited to essentials when her meager salary allowed for such luxuries. Through the peephole, she could see a delivery man in a crisp uniform, holding an arrangement so massive it obscured most of his body. Her first instinct was to not answer, but the man's appearance was professional, official. Maybe it was a mistake, a delivery meant for one of her neighbors. She could simply sign for it and redirect it to the proper recipient. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "I think you have the wrong apartment," she began. "Emma Moore," the delivery man asked, consulting a clipboard with practiced efficiency. The sound of her name from a stranger's lips sent a chill through her. Yes, but I didn't order anything." "Delivery for Emma Moore," he repeated, as if her protests were irrelevant. He held out the clipboard. "Sign here, please." Against her better judgment, Emma found herself signing the tablet, her signature looking shaky and uncertain. The delivery man handed over the arrangement with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes, then disappeared down the hallway without another word. It was not a package from an online order, but a massive, ornate bouquet of roses. They were stunning and impossible, black as a moonless night, their petals like velvet. Emma had never seen roses this color before. She wasn't even sure they existed in nature. They were beautiful and terrible. Like something from a fairy tale, where beauty always came with a curse. She searched through the elaborate arrangement for a card, some indication of the sender, but found nothing except a single, silver letter, A, embossed on a small, heavy pin attached to the black silk ribbon. The A was crafted with obvious expense, real silver, she realized, with tiny diamonds forming the crossbar. It was the kind of detail that spoke of unlimited resources and meticulous attention to effect. Emma's blood ran cold. The voice from the phone, the certainty in those 3 words. No, I don't. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message. She left the flowers on her doorstep, refusing to bring the omen into her home. Let the neighbors wonder. Let the building super complain. She would not allow these symbols of his reach to contaminate her safe space. But even as she closed the door, she could smell their perfume seeping through the wood, a cloying sweetness that seemed to follow her around the apartment. For the rest of the day, she found herself checking the peephole obsessively, expecting to see the roses still there like faithful sentinels. But when evening came and she finally worked up the courage to look, they were gone. No trace remained except for a few black petals scattered on the doormat like drops of dark blood. 2 days later, the email arrived from her bank. Emma was eating a sparse dinner of ramen noodles and canned vegetables when her phone chimed with the notification. First National Bank, important account information. She almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made her open it. Your student loan balance has been updated. Current balance, $0. Emma stared at the screen, certain it was a mistake. Her student loan balance had been $47,000 just the day before, a crushing weight that influenced every financial decision she made. She called the bank, her voice tight with panic, barely able to speak to the customer service representative who cheerfully confirmed the impossible. An anonymous wire transfer had paid the debt in full. The transaction had been processed at 3:17 a.m., an odd time that suggested someone with access to international banking systems. Someone with the resources to move nearly $50,000 as casually as most people bought a cup of coffee. Can you tell me who made the transfer? Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. I'm sorry, ma'am. The transfer was made through a private banking service that maintains client confidentiality. There's no sender information available. Emma hung up and stared at her laptop screen, where her student loan portal showed the same impossible zero balance. This wasn't relief. This wasn't freedom. It was a leash. It was a message screaming that her life, her debts, her very freedom were now under new management. You're provided for. You're owned. The relief she should have felt was replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. Every corner of her life he could touch, he was touching. He was systematically erasing her struggles, and in doing so, erasing her independence. Her debt had been her burden, but it had also been hers. Now even that had been taken away. That night, Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through the implications. The roses had been a demonstration of his reach into her personal space. The loan payment was a demonstration of his reach into her financial life. What would be next? Her job? Her family? How deep did his influence extend? She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That someone had sent her flowers and paid off her debt. They would think she was either lying or insane. She had no proof of threats, no evidence of coercion. Just a phone call, flowers, and an anonymous payment that any reasonable person would see as incredibly fortunate. But Emma knew better. This was just the beginning. The breaking point came a week after the call, on a Tuesday evening when the October air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Emma left the museum later than usual, having spent the afternoon cataloging a particularly complex collection of Civil War correspondence. The work had been absorbing enough to temporarily distract her from the growing anxiety that had become her constant companion. As she pushed through the museum's heavy glass doors, she noticed the black car immediately. It was parked at the curb directly in front of the building, engine running, windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. The car was expensive. A Mercedes, she thought, though she was no expert on luxury vehicles. It was the kind of car that whispered rather than shouted its wealth, understated in the way that only true money could achieve. Emma's steps faltered. In the week since the phone call, she had become hyper-aware of her surroundings, noting every unfamiliar face, every car that seemed to linger too long. Her colleagues had started to comment on her nervousness, her tendency to jump at unexpected sounds. Dr. Winters, the head archivist, had even suggested she take a few days off to rest. She considered turning around, going back into the museum to wait out whoever was in the car. But as she hesitated, the rear door opened with mechanical precision. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, moving with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to physical confrontation. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that suggested regular exercise and careful attention to diet. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, probably costing more than Emma made in 3 months. His face was unremarkable in the way that made him instantly forgettable, the kind of face that witnesses would struggle to describe to police sketchers. "Ms. Moore," he said, his voice polite but carrying an undertone that made Emma's skin crawl. Emma froze, her fight-or-flight instinct screaming at her to run. But her feet seemed rooted to the sidewalk, her body betraying her with its paralysis. "I don't know you," she managed, her voice sounding far braver than she felt. The man smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements that might startle her into running. From his pocket, he withdrew a slim, black device that Emma recognized as a burner phone. "My employer has asked me to give you this," he said, extending his hand. The phone lay in his palm like a digital serpent, its screen dark and lifeless. "Mr. Wilson requires you to keep this on you at all times. It is for his calls only." The name Wilson hit her like a physical blow. He had a name. The monster had a name. Anthony Wilson. She filed it away in her mind, a piece of information that might somehow prove useful. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't want it. Tell him to leave me alone." The man's smile thinned, becoming something predatory. "Ms. Moore, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is not a request." Before she could react, he stepped forward with fluid grace, deftly slipped the phone into her satchel, and retreated to a safe distance. The entire action took perhaps 3 seconds, performed with the efficiency of someone who had done similar things many times before. "Have a pleasant evening," he said, tipping his head in a mockery of politeness. He slid back into the car, and it drove away as silently as it had arrived, leaving her standing on the pavement, violated and powerless. Emma stood there for several minutes after the car disappeared, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure passing pedestrians could hear it. The weight of the foreign phone in her bag felt massive, like carrying a live grenade. She considered throwing it away, dropping it down a storm drain or into a garbage bin, but something told her that would only make things worse. The man had known her name. He had known where she worked. He had been waiting for her, timing his approach for when she would be alone and vulnerable. The level of surveillance that implied was terrifying. How long had they been watching her? How much did they know about her routine, her habits, her life? Back in her apartment, the foreign phone sat on her coffee table like a black monolith of dread. Emma stared at it for an hour, as if she could divine its purpose through sheer force of will. The device was completely nondescript, no brand markings, no unique features. It was the kind of phone that could be bought for cash at any number of electronics stores, untraceable and disposable. When it finally rang, the sound was harsh and unfamiliar, nothing like her usual ringtone. The electronic buzz seemed to fill her entire apartment, echoing off the walls and boring into her skull. Her heart leaped into her throat, and for a moment she considered not answering. But she knew that would only delay the inevitable. With a trembling hand, she swiped to accept the call. "Did you enjoy the flowers, little bird?" Anthony Wilson's voice was unmistakable, a silken poison in her ear. The pet name made her skin crawl. Little bird. Something small and helpless, trapped in a cage of someone else's making. "What do you want from me?" she cried, the carefully constructed walls of her composure finally crumbling. The question came out as more of a sob than words, her voice breaking under the weight of a week's worth of suppressed terror. "I told you," he said, his tone infuriatingly patient, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "I don't want anything. I have what I want." There was a pause, and she could hear him moving on the other end of the line. The clink of glass, perhaps, or the soft rustle of expensive fabric. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a hardness that had been absent before, like steel beneath silk. "This is about your brother." Emma went completely still. Her brother, Ryan. The thought of him brought a complex mixture of emotions: love, frustration, anger, and a protective instinct that had been ingrained in her since childhood. Ryan Lewis, 2 years older but infinitely less responsible. The charming, reckless screw-up she hadn't spoken to in over a year, not since their last fight about his drinking, his gambling, his complete inability to take responsibility for his own life. "What about him?" she whispered, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "Your brother made a mistake," Anthony said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. Even that slight change in tone was enough to make Emma's blood run cold. She could imagine him in whatever expensive office he occupied, perhaps leaning back in a leather chair, completely relaxed while delivering news that would destroy her world. "He tried to take something that belonged to me," Anthony continued, his words precise and measured. "A ledger containing sensitive information. Financial records, transaction details, names and addresses of people who prefer to remain anonymous. The kind of information that certain government agencies would find very interesting." Emma's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. Ryan had always been involved with questionable people, always chasing get-rich-quick schemes and easy money. But theft from organized crime? It seemed almost too stupid even for him. "He failed, of course," Anthony went on, a note of dark amusement creeping into his voice. "My security systems are quite sophisticated, and your brother is not. He was caught within minutes of entering the building. But in his desperation, when my men cornered him, he offered collateral to buy himself some time." The world tilted on its axis. Emma could barely breathe, her lungs feeling like they were filled with concrete instead of air. She knew what was coming next, could feel the words approaching like a freight train she was powerless to stop. "He offered you," Anthony stated, the words landing with the force of a death sentence. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma felt as if she were falling, the solid ground of her reality crumbling beneath her feet. Everything made sense now with horrifying clarity. The wrong number that wasn't wrong at all. The intimate knowledge of her life, her routines, her vulnerabilities. It was all planned, all orchestrated. Her own brother had sold her, served her up to this monster to save his own skin. The betrayal was a physical pain, sharper than the fear. Ryan had always been selfish, always willing to let others pay for his mistakes. But this was beyond anything she had imagined him capable of. He had given her to a man he knew to be dangerous, had traded her safety for his own without a moment's hesitation. "You're lying," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. It explained too much, fit too perfectly with everything she knew about her brother's character. "I have the conversation recorded, if you'd like to hear it," Anthony replied with casual cruelty. "Your brother was quite specific about your habits, your schedule, your weaknesses. He even provided your photograph, though my people had already obtained several better ones." Emma sank onto her couch, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The full scope of the betrayal was beginning to sink in. Ryan hadn't just given them her name and address. He had provided intelligence, detailed information that had allowed them to plan their approach, to know exactly how to manipulate her. "And now," Anthony's voice continued, pulling her back from the abyss of her thoughts, "you have a choice." The word choice was almost laughable. What choice could there be in a situation like this? But she found herself listening despite everything, clinging to the hope that there might be some way out of the nightmare her life had become. Your brother's life for your compliance, Anthony continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone, as if he were negotiating a simple transaction. Accept my protection, and he lives. Continue to resist, and you'll be reading his obituary by the end of the week. The ultimatum was delivered with such casual certainty that Emma had no doubt he meant every word. This wasn't a bluff or an empty threat. This was a man who had killed before and would kill again without losing a moment's sleep. I need time to think, she said, her voice barely a whisper. No, Anthony replied immediately. You have until tomorrow evening. I'll call you at 8 o'clock sharp for your decision. I suggest you use the time wisely. The line went dead, but the ultimatum echoed in the suffocating silence of her apartment. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to decide between her brother's life and her own freedom, as if there was really any choice at all. Emma sat in the darkness of her living room, tears of rage and terror streaming down her face. But then, slowly, something began to shift inside her. The terror remained, a constant cold weight in her chest, but the rage began to cool, crystallizing into something harder and more useful. Resolve, determination, a cold, calculated fury that burned brighter than panic. She was an archivist, a researcher. Her entire life was about finding patterns, connecting dots that others missed, and digging up buried truths from the most unlikely places. She understood how to be patient, how to sift through vast amounts of information to find the one crucial detail that changed everything. If Anthony Wilson thought he could simply take her, use her, and discard her when he was finished, he was about to learn something about the woman he had chosen to victimize. She would not be a pawn in his game. She would not go quietly into whatever cage he had prepared for her. She would learn everything there was to know about Anthony Wilson, and then she would find a way to destroy him. For the next 20 hours, Emma didn't sleep. Fueled by coffee, determination, and a burning fury that surprised her with its intensity, she turned her professional skills into a weapon. She began systematically dissecting Anthony Wilson's public persona, looking for cracks in the facade, weak points that could be exploited. The public records were frustratingly clean. Anthony Wilson appeared to be a reclusive billionaire who had emerged onto the business scene about 10 years ago with seemingly unlimited capital and an uncanny ability to identify profitable investments. He was described in business magazines as a mysterious philanthropist and private wealth manager who shunned publicity and rarely gave interviews. His business holdings were diverse: real estate development, import-export companies, private security firms, and several charitable foundations. On paper, he looked like nothing more than an eccentric rich man with a talent for making money and a preference for staying out of the spotlight. But Emma had spent years learning to read between the lines of official documents. The portfolio was too clean, too perfect. The timeline didn't quite work. Where had all that initial capital come from? How did someone with no apparent background in business suddenly become so successful? So she went deeper, using techniques she had developed for historical research. She cross-referenced incorporation dates, looked for patterns in the businesses he acquired, traced shell companies and holding corporations. She used the museum's restricted databases, accessing digitized newspaper archives, court records, and municipal documents that weren't available to the general public. Slowly, very slowly, a different picture began to emerge. A shadow corporation called Parker Industries kept appearing in the periphery of Wilson's legitimate businesses. Parker Industries had been dissolved in 1999, but during its existence, it had been linked to a series of unsolved disappearances, suspected money laundering operations, and what federal investigators had termed organized criminal activity. Parker Industries had been owned by a man named George Parker, who had vanished without a trace 20 years ago. The FBI had suspected Parker of running a sophisticated criminal organization that laundered money for drug cartels and provided problem-solving services for wealthy clients who needed to avoid legal complications. Emma's pulse quickened as she dug deeper into the Parker connection. George Parker had disappeared just as a federal task force was closing in on his organization. His body was never found, His assets were never recovered, and the investigation had eventually gone cold. But some of those assets had eventually surfaced years later, purchased by newly formed companies that could now be traced back to Anthony Wilson's business empire. It was a thread, a tiny, frayed thread that connected the respectable businessman to a disappeared crime boss. But it was something she could work with, a crack in the perfect facade. Emma was in the deepest, most remote section of the archives late the following night, long after the museum had closed to the public. She had used her keycard to access areas that were normally restricted, following leads that required examining physical documents that had never been digitized. A single desk lamp cut a pool of yellow light in the oppressive darkness, creating a small island of illumination in the vast sea of shadows. The archives after hours were a different world from the daytime bustle of researchers and tourists. The silence was profound, broken only by the building's subtle sounds, the whisper of the climate control system, the soft settling of old wood and stone. Emma had always found it peaceful, but tonight every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. She had been at this for hours, following a lead that had taken her through city planning documents from the 1990s. She was looking for any mention of properties that had been owned by Parker Industries, anything that might give her insight into Wilson's current operations. And then she found it. Buried in a folder of miscellaneous real estate transfers, she discovered a faded photograph that made her heart stop. It was from an old society column, the kind of puff piece that newspapers used to fill space. The caption read, "Young entrepreneurs George Parker and Anthony Wilson at the annual Businessmen's Association Charity Gala, 1995. The photograph showed a much younger Anthony Wilson standing just behind George Parker, who was shaking hands with some local politician. Wilson looked to be in his early 20s, impeccably dressed even then, but there was something in his posture, in the way he stood slightly behind and to the right of Parker, that suggested a subordinate relationship. He wasn't just an associate. He was a protege, an heir apparent. Emma stared at the photograph, her mind racing through the implications. This was proof of a connection between Wilson and the missing crime boss. It might not be enough to convince a court, but it was something she could work with, leverage she might be able to use. A soft click echoed from somewhere in the darkness, beyond her small pool of light. Emma's head snapped up, every nerve ending suddenly on high alert. The sound had come from the far end of the long aisle, near the main entrance to this section of the archives. It could have been anything, the building settling, a book shifting on an overloaded shelf. But her instincts, heightened by days of paranoia, screamed that she was no longer alone. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vast space. "Security." The response was the loud clank of the main electrical breaker being thrown. The entire archives section was plunged into absolute blackness, a darkness so complete it was like being buried alive. Emma's small desk lamp had died with the rest of the power, leaving her in a void where she couldn't even see her own hands. Her breath hitched in panic. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately cut the power, and there could only be one reason for such an action. She fumbled for her phone, trying to activate its flashlight with trembling fingers. The small beam cut through the darkness, creating a weak circle of light that only emphasized how vast and threatening the shadows had become. A slow, deliberate footstep echoed through the silence, then another. The sound was measured, unhurried, like someone taking a leisurely stroll through a garden rather than stalking prey in the darkness. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide their approach. They wanted her to know they were coming. Emma's phone light wavered as her hands shook. She could see tall shelves stretching up into the darkness on either side of her narrow aisle, filled with countless boxes and files that could hide an army of threats. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing off the high ceiling in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where they were coming from. A silhouette appeared at the far end of the aisle, backlit by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. It was tall and perfectly proportioned, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in their own body. The figure wasn't hurrying or sneaking. It was simply walking toward her with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. It wasn't one of his men. It was him. Anthony Wilson materialized from the shadows like something out of a nightmare, stepping into the faint beam of her phone's flashlight with the dramatic flair of an actor taking the stage. In person, he was even more imposing than his voice had suggested. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the predatory grace of a big cat, every step calculated for maximum impact. His suit was midnight blue, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even in the dim illumination of her phone, she could see it was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than she made in 6 months. His shirt was crisp white, his tie a shade of silver that caught what little light there was. He looked like he had stepped out of a boardroom meeting rather than breaking into a dusty archive in the middle of the night. But it was his face that truly terrified her. He was handsome in the classical sense, strong jawline, high cheekbones, dark hair swept back with precision. He could have been a movie star or a politician, someone who belonged on magazine covers and red carpets. But his eyes were the pale gray of winter ice, completely devoid of warmth or human emotion. They were the eyes of a predator, a man who viewed other people as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even menacing in any obvious way. He looked impressed. "You are more resourceful than I anticipated," he said, his voice carrying easily through the darkness. Without the filter of a phone, it was even more commanding, a low vibration that seemed to settle in her bones and make her feel weak. "That makes you far more valuable." He took another step closer, and Emma could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, with notes of cedar and bergamot. It was the scent of wealth and power, applied with the same precision as everything else about him. "You think you're looking for a way out," he continued, gesturing casually at the file she was still clutching to her chest. "But you've only dug yourself deeper in." His gaze dropped to the photograph she had discovered, the one that proved his connection to George Parker. Instead of concern or anger, his expression showed something that might have been amusement. "That secret you found. I wanted you to find it. I needed to see if you were clever enough." Emma's mind reeled, trying to process what he was saying. This had been a test, all of it. The careful research, the hours of digging through records, the moment of triumph when she thought she had found something to use against him. It had all been orchestrated. "The photograph was placed in that file 3 days ago," Anthony explained, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "Along with several other carefully selected documents that I thought might interest someone with your particular skills. I needed to know if you were just a frightened little mouse, or if you had the intelligence to be useful to me." The words hit her like physical blows. He had been watching her, monitoring her research, staying several steps ahead of her even as she thought she was gaining ground on him. The revelation was devastating, not just because it meant her efforts had been futile, but because it demonstrated just how completely under his control she already was. "Useful for what?" she whispered, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Anthony smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any scowl could have been. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards and was enjoying the game immensely. "Clever enough for what comes next," he said, as if reading her thoughts. He was standing before her now, close enough that she could see the subtle pattern woven into his tie, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. This close, she could see that he was younger than she had imagined, probably in his early 40s, though his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen and done far more than most people twice his age. "You see, Emma," he continued, using her first name with an intimacy that made her skin crawl, "I have a problem. My organization has grown quite large over the years, quite complex. We have legitimate businesses, charitable foundations, political connections, all very respectable on the surface. But maintaining that respectability requires careful documentation." He paused, letting his words sink in. Emma's mind was racing, trying to understand where this was leading. "I need someone with your particular skill set," Anthony explained. "Someone who understands how to organize information, how to create filing systems that appear completely innocent to casual observers, but can hide more sensitive material when necessary. Someone who knows how to make certain documents disappear entirely, or how to create new ones with convincing historical provenance." The full horror of what he was suggesting began to dawn on her. He didn't just want to own her. He wanted to use her professional skills to help him legitimize his criminal empire. He wanted her to become complicit in his crimes, to use her expertise to help him hide evidence and create false histories. "I won't do it," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Anthony's smile widened. "Oh, but you will. Because the alternative is watching your brother die slowly and painfully, followed by everyone else you've ever cared about. Your elderly mother in the assisted living facility. Your college roommate Jennifer, who just got married and is expecting her first child. Your supervisor, Dr. Winters, who has been like a father figure to you since you started working here." Each name hit her like a hammer blow. He knew about her mother's health problems, knew about Jennifer's pregnancy, knew about her relationship with Dr. Winters. The depth of his surveillance was staggering and terrifying. "But it won't come to that," Anthony continued, his tone becoming almost gentle, like a parent explaining something to a confused child. "Because you're going to make the smart choice. You're going to accept the position I'm offering you with all the benefits that come with it." "What benefits?" Emma asked, hatting herself for even entertaining the question but unable to stop herself from asking. "A generous salary, far more than you're making here. A beautiful apartment in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. A wardrobe befitting your new position. Access to resources most archivists can only dream of. Private collections, rare documents, historical artifacts worth millions." He paused, studying her reaction. "And most importantly, the protection of someone who can ensure that no harm ever comes to you or anyone you care about. The world is a dangerous place, Emma. Accidents happen. People disappear. But those under my protection are perfectly safe." The offer was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. He was describing a gilded cage, a life of luxury and privilege that would cost her everything that made her who she was. She would have everything she could want except freedom, except the ability to choose her own path. "The games are over, Emma," Anthony said, his voice taking on a note of finality. "Your old life ended the moment you answered that phone call. Your new life begins now." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope, offering it to her with the same casual gesture he might use to hand someone a business card. "Inside you'll find keys to your new apartment, credit cards in your name, and detailed instructions for your first assignment. You have until tomorrow evening to move your things and settle in. Stephen will collect you at precisely 8 o'clock to take you to your new home." Emma stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Taking it would be an admission of defeat, a surrender to his will. But what choice did she really have? Her brother's life, her mother's safety, the well-being of everyone she cared about, all of it hung in the balance. "What if I run?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "What if I just disappear, leave the city, change my name?" Anthony chuckled, the sound echoing through the dark archive like the whisper of death itself. "My dear girl, there is nowhere on this earth you could go that I couldn't find you. I have resources you can't imagine, connections in every major city in the world. Running would only delay the inevitable and make things much worse for everyone involved." He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel his breath on her cheek. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but each word was perfectly clear. "Besides, you don't really want to run. Part of you is curious about what I'm offering. Part of you has always wondered what it would be like to have real power, real influence. To be part of something bigger than cataloging dusty old documents in a forgotten corner of a half-empty museum." Emma wanted to deny it, but there was a grain of truth in his words that made her feel sick. She had always been invisible, always been overlooked. How many times had she fantasized about being important, about having influence, about mattering in some meaningful way? "I can see it in your eyes," Anthony continued, his voice hypnotic and persuasive. "The part of you that's tired of being nobody, tired of living paycheck to paycheck, tired of being afraid. I'm offering you a chance to be powerful, to be protected, to be valued. All you have to do is say yes." The envelope hung between them like a bridge between two worlds. The gray, ordinary life she had always known, and the dark, dangerous one he was offering. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the manila paper. But at the last moment, she pulled back. "I need time to think." Anthony's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around them, like the pressure drop before a storm. "I'm afraid time is a luxury you no longer possess. The decision must be made now." "Then I choose my brother," Emma said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I choose to comply, but I have conditions." Anthony raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, but I'm willing to listen." "I want proof that my brother is safe. I want regular communication with him, and I want assurance that my mother and friends will be protected regardless of what happens to me." "Reasonable requests," Anthony nodded. "Consider them granted. Anything else?" Emma took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would seal her fate irrevocably. "I want to understand exactly what you're asking me to do. I want to know the full scope of my responsibilities and the nature of the organization I'm joining." Anthony's smile returned, but this time it seemed genuine rather than predatory. "Now you're asking the right questions. Very good, Emma. You're going to fit in perfectly." He gestured for her to follow him, turning and walking back toward the entrance to the archives. "Come, we have much to discuss, and I prefer to conduct important conversations in more comfortable surroundings." Emma found herself following him, the envelope clutched in her shaking hands. As they walked through the darkened halls of the museum, past the familiar exhibits and displays that had been her world for so long, she felt like she was walking through a graveyard. Every step took her further from the person she had been and closer to whatever she was about to become. "One last question," she said as they reached the main entrance, where a car waited with its engine running. Anthony paused, his hand on the door handle. "Yes." "The phone call. Why did you really choose me? It can't just be because of Ryan. There must be dozens of people with my skills who would be easier to control." For the first time since she had met him, Anthony's mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine emotion beneath the cold calculation. "Because," he said quietly, "in all my research, in all the surveillance and background checks and psychological profiles, I found something in you that I hadn't expected to find. Something I recognized." "What?" "A kindred spirit," he said, opening the car door and gesturing for her to get in. "Someone who understands that sometimes, to protect the people we love, we have to become someone we never thought we could be." As Emma slid into the leather seats of the luxury car, she realized that Anthony Wilson had been right about one thing: the games were over. But as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows and they drove toward whatever new life awaited her, she couldn't shake the feeling that a different, far more dangerous game was just beginning. And this time, she intended to learn the rules before anyone else realized she was playing.